Did you know that one of the princes in the tower was married, and it wasn't even the older one? This is the sad story of the life, death, and 3 burials of royal child bride Anne Mowbray, Duchess of York. And I'm warning you now, one of her exhumations and reburials was in the 1960s, so there will be a discussion of the condition of this girl's remains at that point. Leave now if that's going to gross you out. Lady Anne Mowbray was born at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk on the 10th of December 1472, the daughter of John Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, and his wife, the former Lady Elizabeth Talbot. She was to be their only child. We have an account of her christening from a contemporary letter written by John Paston to Sir John Paston on the 18th of December that year. And if you're not familiar with them, the Paston letters are a famous collection of correspondence written to and by that family, which are an amazing source for medieval England. The letter says that the bishop, meaning William Waynflete, Bishop of Winchester, came to Framlingham on Wednesday night, and on Thursday by X, meaning 10 of the clock before noon, my young lady was christened and named Anne. The bishop christened it and was godfather both. Her 31-year-old father died unexpectedly in January 1476, despite having appeared to be in good health the day before, leaving 3-year-old Anne a very wealthy heiress and a great catch on the marriage market. Almost immediately, the king, Edward IV, decided that he wanted her as a bride for his younger son, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, born on the 17th of August 1473 and known to history as the younger of the princes in the Tower. What the king wanted, the king got, though it took a while to organise as a papal dispensation had to be obtained for the union as the youngsters were so young and distant cousins. This was issued in Rome on the 12th of May 1477, and in the meantime, little Richard was given all the Mowbray titles, including being made Earl of Nottingham on the 12th of June 1476 and Duke of Norfolk and Earl Warren on the 7th of February 1477. His royal dukedom of York was still the senior title though, and the one by which he was known. Finally, with the dispensation in hand, the 2 children went through a marriage ceremony on the 15th of January 1478 in St. Stephen's Chapel in Westminster, which was officiated by James Goldwell, Bishop of Norwich. The bride had just turned 5, the groom was 4. This was very unusual, even at that time, given their age. I imagine both bride and groom would have struggled to even say many of the words in a marriage ceremony, so perhaps it was simplified to account for their ages, and had they both lived, they would have gone through another ceremony when they reached the legal age for marriage, which was 12 for a girl and 14 for a boy. The marriage was mentioned in another letter by John Paston on the 21st of January 1478, in which he said, "We would fain hear of all your royalty at London, as of the marriage of my Lord of York." Now, if you look in some secondary sources, and I've left details of a couple of the main ones I used for this video in the description box, you do find a pretty detailed account of this wedding, which appears to come from a book published in 1840 and written by a W. H. Black called Illustrations of Ancient State and Chivalry. I assume this in turn was quoting an original 15th century source, but I can't get a hold of that book, so just take what follows with a little caution because I haven't been able to check the source. Apparently, this wedding was a spectacular affair. Most of the royal family were present, and the chapel had been laid with carpets and draped in a canopy of state. Anne was prepared in the Queen's chamber, then led into the chapel by her fiancé's maternal uncle, Lord Rivers, and paternal cousin, the Earl of Lincoln. After the dispensation was read out, the marriage ceremony took place, followed by a feast in the King's chamber afterwards. Over the next week, there were jousts and tournaments to celebrate it further, with 24 Knights of the Bath created. As prizes for those who had won the jousts, there were jewels handed out by Anne and her new sister-in-law, Princess Elizabeth of York, which had on them, or maybe they were in these shapes, the letters A, E and M in diamond, ruby and emerald respectively. The A and M were obviously for Anne Mowbray. The E could have been for the King, the Queen, the Prince of Wales, who was the future Edward V, the Princess Elizabeth, or the bride's mother. The union was a huge gamble for the extended Mowbray family, for the king in his greed ensured that an Act of Parliament of 1478 decreed that all of Anne's lands would go to her husband if she died before him, instead of her other blood heirs, who were called William Lord Berkeley and John Lord Howard. Berkeley had also been persuaded to surrender his claim in June 1476 in exchange for the cancellation of debts to the Crown amounting to £34,000, which would be in the region of £35 million in today's money, but Howard got nothing. The Norfolk estates were managed by the Queen Consort, Elizabeth Woodville, during Richard and Anne's short marriage, but the Mowbray family's hopes that they would at least have a royal duchess in their clan were dashed on the 19th of November 1481, when Anne died of an unknown cause at Greenwich, a month before her 9th birthday. Her father's dukedom did make its way back to one of her blood heirs, though. After Edward IV's death in April 1483, his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, declared Anne's husband and his older brother, Edward V, were illegitimate and took the crown for himself. He also granted the Dukedom of Norfolk to John Howard on the 28th of June, before he'd even legally stripped it from Richard of Shrewsbury. Did he do so because he knew the previous holder was already dead? People have been wondering about that for centuries, so I'll leave you to make your own mind up. If you're wondering, however, personally I do think that King Richard had his nephews killed in the summer or early autumn of 1483, though it's an opinion that wins me no fans amongst the Ricardians. To learn why I think this, though, see my video all about the princes in the Tower, in which I go through all the evidence, plus my videos on whether DNA could identify their supposed bones in Westminster Abbey, and a couple of others I have which look at recent theories put forth in TV documentaries about what happened to them. Everything is linked in the description box for you. So John Mowbray went from getting nothing of the Mowbray inheritance in 1478 to walking away with the main title just 5 years later. Of course, like Richard III, who had also got his title thanks to the demise of his nephews, Howard didn't have long to enjoy it. Both men died at the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485. Now, we know from the later discovery of Anne's coffin that her death was unexpected because it was so evidently put together in a hurry, but more on that in a few minutes. Her initial burial was in Westminster Abbey in the chapel of St. Erasmus, which had been founded by her mother-in-law, Queen Elizabeth Woodville. Again, I have more details from a 2016 article I read, which says that her body was taken from Greenwich to Westminster by barge, and her funeral cost £215, 16 shillings 10 pence, but the authors provided no primary source for that information. However she got to Westminster Abbey, she didn't stay there for a particularly long time. At some point, she was disinterred and moved elsewhere in London to the Abbey of the Minoresses of St. Clair without Aldgate, where her mother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, spent her retirement in a house on the grounds before her own death in 1506 or 1507. Now, the most likely date for the move was in about 1502, when the chapel of St. Erasmus was being taken down so that the huge Henry VII Lady Chapel, which we see today, could be put up in its place. This disturbed many older burials, and it is logical enough that Henry VII, who was technically Anne's brother-in-law, having married her husband's sister Elizabeth of York, moved this little girl to a different building which was connected to her mother. Perhaps the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk was even given the choice of where her only child would now lie, and opted to keep her close to herself. Thanks to the English Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries during Henry VIII's reign, the Abbey of the Minoresses was closed in 1539, which tells us that Anne's body certainly wasn't moved there any later than that. What remained of the building seen in Henry VIII's reign was largely destroyed by fire in 1796, and the fact that Anne had been buried there was forgotten by history, which continued to assume that she lay somewhere in Westminster Abbey. More than 4 centuries went by. Then, on the 11th of December 1964, the rectangular vault, measuring 6 feet high by 7 feet long by 4 feet wide, in which Anne's lead coffin was lying, was accidentally rediscovered 11 feet below ground level by workmen in St. Clair Street, Stepney, London. She was alone, so her mother evidently wasn't buried with her in the end, which isn't surprising as she'd asked to be interred in the nuns' choir in her will. The workmen put a chain around the coffin and lifted it out with their machinery. Unfortunately, this rough handling, which would make any professional archaeologist throw up in their mouth, then continued as the coffin was stood up on its end for photographs to be taken of it with the workmen who had called the local press. It was then taken to Leman Street Police Station, where a found property label was draped around the neck. Shortly after, it was taken by Dr. Francis Saloria, possibly Caloria, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, of the London Museum in the back of his Land Rover. It spent a night there in a disused warehouse south of Blackfriars until the museum, which was housed in Kensington Palace and couldn't be accessed after hours, was open again. It was easy enough to identify, as it possessed a Latin inscription on a banner which was attached to the chest area of the coffin. Once it had been cleaned and could be translated and read, it was discovered that it said, "Here lies Anne, Duchess of York, daughter and heiress of John, late Duke of Norfolk, Earl Marshal, Earl of Nottingham and Warren, Marshal of England, Lord of Mowbray, Seagrave and Gower, late wife of Richard, Duke of York, second son of the most illustrious Prince, Edward IV, King of England and France and Lord of Ireland, who died at Greenwich on the 19th day of November in the year of our Lord, 1481, and the 21st year of the said Lord King," meaning the 21st year of his reign, not his life, of course. Anne's coffin was roughly shaped around the head, then tapered down the body to the feet. The fact that it was not better shaped indicated the speed with which it had been put together. It was 4 feet, 8.5 inches long, 10 3/4 inches wide across the shoulders, and 7.5 inches deep across the face, which was the deepest part. There was no outer wooden coffin present. If one existed, it had completely decomposed. The lead coffin was soon opened on the 20th of December, and Anne's remains were revealed. Just before I get to the condition they were in, though, I thought you'd like to see this black and white photo of the coffin before opening, as it's better than any description I can give you, and it's so rare that you get to see a medieval coffin of a named individual of such high rank and in such a good state of preservation. The body had been wrapped in many layers of a yellowish linen shroud or cerecloth about 1/2 inch thick, coated with beeswax and seemingly decorated with gold leaf or thread. We know these details because the rotting remains of this shroud, along with gold fragments, were still in the coffin. It did not cover her face, which was instead possibly covered with a sudarium, a kind of linen face cloth, if you will, used to wipe the face during life. Her head rested on the rotted remains of a herb pillow. There were no other grave goods, such as jewellery or belt buckles present, and no traces of any clothing she might have been buried in had survived. It was commented on at the time that the lack of a wedding ring was a little surprising, but I wonder if Anne even owned one that fitted. She will have outgrown whatever was put on her hand as a 5-year-old, and perhaps there were no plans to get her a replacement until she was fully grown and she and Richard could presumably go through another marriage ceremony. She was in an advanced state of decomposition, pretty much skeletonized in fact, as the coffin was not airtight. There were old holes in the foot of it and on its side next to the right side of her neck. We therefore don't know what embalming procedures might have been carried out on her, as the soft tissue was gone. Apart from the skull, the rest of the bones were not in the correct position, probably because of the rough handling the coffin had received from the workmen, though I suppose we might argue that perhaps the original disinterment had contributed to this as well. There were no bones in the chest area, for instance, just a muddy pool of water, with the bones gathered up lower down the coffin. Her pelvis was also fractured, seemingly from the same rough handling just 9 days earlier. Much of her shoulder-length hair remained attached to her skull and was auburn in colour, more evident once it had been cleaned. Some of her roots had atrophied, indicating poor health near death, which is what we would expect given that there's no suggestion that she died as a result of an accident. Tests on the hair also showed abnormally high levels of arsenic, antimony and gold. Now, the hair probably absorbed some gold from its contact with the inside of the coffin, but the arsenic and antimony had surely been administered to her as part of a medical treatment, and again they support the idea that she died from an illness, yet not one which was expected to take her when it did, given the relatively crude nature of the coffin construction. Her zinc levels were low, which can suggest leukemia. However, the 2016 article I read also noted that some of the zinc present could have been exchanged with the calcium in the water, meaning the liquid in the coffin. See my video on old medical treatments to hear more about why you should be grateful you have access to 21st century medicine instead of what Anne was faced with. Though all the Duchess's teeth were present, some had become detached from the skull and she had dental caries showing they weren't well cleaned. Radiographs of her head showed that she lacked upper and lower adult molars on her left, which was a congenital defect also noted in the supposed bones of the princes in the Tower when they were examined in the 1930s. Due to this similarity, it has been claimed that this is further evidence that those bones really are Anne's husband and brother-in-law, also her distant cousins. But in fact, it's a moderately common occurrence and doesn't really prove anything. The little girl was estimated to be between 4 feet 1 inch and 4 feet 3 3/4 inches in height, making her short for her age by modern standards, which would assign this height to a child between 5.5 and 6.5 years old, and suggesting malnutrition. This is not to say she didn't have enough to eat, but rather that she wasn't getting the correct nutrients to promote growth. Another interesting facet of her remains were the nails, which had been cut in odd shapes, not square or arched as we would do, but in a kind of semi-hexagonal shape. Now, there are some photographs of the skeleton in existence. However, you can't show things like that on YouTube without risking monetization woes. So if you want to see them, you'll need to join my Patreon site at patreon.com/historycalling at either the historical figure or time traveller tiers, where I'll be sharing them this week. You can also join at the lower tiers for other bonus material, like more extra podcasts and recommendations for other great history content on the web, or you can buy many of my posts on an individual basis in my Patreon shop if you don't want to commit to a monthly subscription. I'll leave it linked below for you. The plan had been to conduct a thorough study of the skeleton, coffin, and surviving grave goods, which would have resulted in further discoveries of things like Anne's blood group using her bone marrow and a facial reconstruction being undertaken, which was then a cutting-edge procedure. However, there was public outcry in the press and from descendants of Anne's family at the disturbance of this child's grave and at the idea of her being studied, coupled with demands that she be reinterred as fast as possible. The issue of how to treat her was even debated in the House of Lords on the 11th of March 1965. There was also the fact that the London Museum had not obtained a burial licence from the Home Office when Anne was found, and so had no legal right to hold her. A licence was obtained retroactively in April, and Lord Stoneham laid out its details in the House of Lords on the 13th of that month, saying, "The licence includes the following conditions. First, no interference with the remains shall take place other than that necessarily required for the purpose of A. the identification, cleaning and putting together in good order, and B. the scientific measurement, comparison and examination of the remains. Secondly, the replacement of the remains in the casket in which they were found shall take place not later than May 15th, 1965, and no further interference shall take place after that date. Thirdly, the Dean of Westminster has indicated his willingness that the remains should be reinterred in Westminster Abbey, and accordingly, when the remains have been replaced in the casket, they shall be handed over by the Director of the London Museum to the Dean of Westminster for reinterment. Fourthly, nothing in these conditions shall prevent any action necessary for the purpose of taking a cast of the inscription on the casket in which the remains were originally discovered." With this time limit in place and restrictions on what could be done to the remains, the initial plan of investigation was severely curtailed. Now you can let me know what you think of this in the comments. On the one hand, it is incredibly rare to find a named individual from the medieval period whose exact age at the time of death was also known, and so the study of Anne's remains was, much like that of Richard III in the 2010s, a rare opportunity to better understand not just death and burial practices of the time, but to look at things like her height and dental development and get some hard data about how these progressed in high-status people of the day. On the other hand, is it disrespectful to use a dead person's body for experiments without their permission and disturb the Christian burial or other religious or culturally significant burial given to them by their family members and friends just to satisfy our own curiosity? I have a whole video on the practice of displaying dead bodies, such as Egyptian mummies and bog people, in which I debate these kinds of questions in more detail, and which I'll leave linked for you, along with my video on the journey Richard III's remains have been on. The bones were duly released for reburial at the end of May, having been placed back in the original coffin, which was soldered back together again. Anne lay in state in the Jerusalem chamber of Westminster Abbey on the 31st of that month for a few hours. Her coffin was on a table with 4 candlesticks and a cross around it, and draped in a cloth displaying the Tudor insignia and the arms of the abbey. Why the Tudors were represented, I don't know, given that Anne was, by marriage, a Plantagenet princess. There was then a private service, including a medieval requiem mass, because Anne will have been Catholic, remember. The Times newspaper gave this account of her reinterment the following day, saying that after the lying in state, about 30 people, including Lord and Lady Mowbray, collateral descendants of Anne, Sir Frank Sauce-Kais, Home Secretary, and Lady Sauce-Kais, I bet I'm not pronouncing that correctly, and Lieutenant Colonel Eric Penn, representing the Queen, walked in procession through the echoing abbey to Henry VII's chapel at the East End. The brief ceremony, lasting 10 minutes, including the special readings from the Bible for Holy Innocents' Day, the 23rd Psalm, and prayers. Anne now lies in the Duke of Buckingham's chapel within the larger Henry VII chapel. Thus, she is almost back where she started, and lies close to the remains of her supposed husband. A stone bearing the arms of her husband, impaling those of Brotherton and Mowbray, was placed in the floor over the vault with the following inscription on it. 1472, Anne, 1481. Daughter of John Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, child wife of Richard, Duke of York, second son of King Edward IV, was originally buried near this place. On the rebuilding of this chapel in 1502, her coffin was removed to the Church of the Minoresses of St. Clair, London, on the site of which church it was discovered in 1964, and reburied here the 31st of May 1965. Now, just to remind you, what the stone says about her body being moved in 1502 is just a guess, not a fact. But in any case, this stone is unfortunately now covered up by a portable organ. And so we come to the end of the story of the life, death, and 3 burials of Anne Mowbray, Duchess of York, and wife of one of the princes in the Tower. If you enjoyed it, I'd be very grateful if you would give the video a like and subscribe to the channel too if you haven't already, as this shows YouTube my content is good quality and helps to promote it. If you activate the notification bell, you'll also be alerted to all my latest uploads. For more history from me, you can also join my YouTube channel membership by clicking the join button under videos and following the on-screen instructions. And you can buy my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors, online as a paperback and ebook from Amazon. It's linked below. Thank you very much to those of you who support me using the thanks button underneath videos as well, as this is very much appreciated. But if you're unable to support financially, which is absolutely fine because I know not everyone can or wants to, but would still like some bonus material, then sign up to my free mailing list on my website, historycallingofficial.com, to get 2 complimentary downloads right away about spotting good history books and interviewing family members about your family tree, plus my monthly newsletter. I'll leave that link below for you, and you can, of course, unsubscribe at any time. Remember to let me know in the comments if you think further study of Anne's remains and coffin should have been allowed before her reburial. And for more on her husband, Prince Richard, and her brother-in-law, Edward V, try one of my videos on the princes in the Tower. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.